I save you.
Pulitzer Prize-winning author Bill Keller argues that incarceration here in America is a shameful waste of lives and money. The former New York Times executive editor says prison rehabilitation in this country has been neglected.
You can't base a legal system on anger. Cooler heads have to prevail at some point. There are bad people, whether because of mental illness, because of an evil attitude. But as a general rule, I don't think you want to define somebody by the worst thing they ever did.
I'm Eddie Robinson. Stay tuned as we chat unguarded with the founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, Bill Keller. The acclaimed author of What's Prison For? Builds a compelling case that criminal justice reform must take place now. Who or what is standing in the way? What prison success looks like overseas? And can educational programming and therapeutic interventions really solve the problem? Oh yeah, I feel you. We hear you. I see you. You're listening to I See You. I'm your host, Eddie Robinson. We're fortunate to have with us in studio Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Bill Keller. He's also the former executive editor of the New York Times, and his latest book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration, is available now from Columbia Global Reports, who's the publisher. Bill, thank you so much for being a guest on I See You.
Thanks for having me.
You know, our show, Bill, debuted in 2021, and we invited death row exoneree Anthony Graves to the show. And he spent nearly 20 years in prison for a violent crime he did not commit, including 12 years on death row. And while he was in prison, he also received 2 execution dates. So mentally, that had to have had a strain on him. Forget about the issues relating to him not being able to spend time with his family, with his children. His story, unfortunately, is not an isolated event, and he quickly brought up some intense and at times very angry remarks that were being directed to the state of Texas, and how this region could allow the system to inflict such injustice on someone. And, I'm sure it's because of his color of his skin,
And this state owed me, and this state would owe me for the rest of my life and for the rest of its existence. So what I ask from this state is to hear my voice, hear my story, and move to action. I don't want no more of your money. I can make my own money. I just want you to do the right thing, put the right policies in place, and treat us all equally and fairly. To me, that's compensation. Nothing else is.
I'd really like to start our conversation here and frankly talk about the South. And because in your book, you do a great job of showing how rehabilitation has been neglected, especially here in facilities in the South. Why do you think that's still the case?
Texas comes up in my book in a few different places, and the collection of them tells you a little something about the craziness of Texas. Point number 1, in Austin, there's a group called Right on Crime, which is sort of the conservative approach to criminal justice reform, which for a while looked like it was going to be one of those Nixon to China moments. Back in 2016, 4 of the Republican presidential candidates were embraced by Right on Crime, including Ted Cruz. So Austin's become a kind of focal point for one aspect of the criminal justice system. Another is a guy named Aaron Flaherty, who's been in for 20 years, I think, for murder, who I interviewed. He's written a book. It's basically a guide to how to fix the Texas prison system.
Wow.
It is full of wisdom. I quote him a fair amount in my book, but I actually went and got his book. But another aspect of Texas that crops up in the book is the Prison Entrepreneurship Program, the PEP program, which I'm sure you're familiar with. There are a couple of raps you can say against that program. And what they do is they select out prison inmates who really want to change their lives, and they give them a kind of mini MBA program that teach them basic business skills and encourage them to devise a project, a business venture that they would like to start. And in some cases, they come up with grants for them once they've been released. One of the raps is that it's got a heavy Christian component, and some people find that a little off-putting. And another is that they cherry-pick the students most likely to succeed. I tend to be forgiving of that because success is so rare in prison. that success is success. And they've put 2,800 men through their program. Baylor did a study of the impact, and 40% of them own their own homes. The recidivism rate is something like 8% compared to 23% statewide.
Sure.
So some good things are happening, but if you read Aaron Flaherty's book, the basic structure is still one of stealing people's dignity and keeping them in cages.
Give us an idea as to, why you decided to write a book like this. What led you, or what brought you to this passion of wanting to focus on criminal justice reform, and why talk about prisons?
Well, I came late to criminal justice reform. In 2014, at that point, I'd been working at the New York Times for 30 years, and at that particular point, I was writing an op-ed column. And a guy named Neil Barsky called me up, invited me to breakfast. He was a former Wall Street Journal reporter who got himself very rich in hedge funds and started a philanthropy. And his parents had been active in the civil rights movement. So his idea seems like a harebrained idea at the time, 2014, when newsrooms were slashing budgets and newspapers were folding. To start a nonprofit news organization seemed ridiculous. But he brought the idea was to do independent investigative journalism focused on the criminal justice system.
Okay.
I pushed the pause button for a little while and just exploited my office as an op-ed columnist to write a couple of columns on criminal justice and get my first introduction to it. And I've got to tell you, before I did that, I don't think I could have told you what the difference is between a jail and a prison. I certainly could not have reeled off a lot of the data that I subsequently accumulated. But I was hooked. I mean, the system is so much worse than we think it is. And most of us prefer not to think about it a lot. That I was willing to commit, at least for starting the Marshall Project. And then I had 5 years as editor of the Marshall Project, surrounded by bright, mostly young reporters and editors, digging into visiting prisons, interviewing cops, taking a hard look at prosecutors and how they do their job. Won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. And the book draws very heavily on the work that they did. It's not all mine.
And I also enjoy the fact that in this book you make comparisons of American prisons to their foreign counterparts, noting that, for instance, in Germany, prison staff there are concerned less as jailers and more as therapists or social workers. Were you at all shocked or surprised to learn of these differences, right, as it relates to the role of a corrections officer or a jailer in other parts of the world versus here in the United States?
Yeah, I was definitely surprised. I mean, in Germany, if you're going to be a corrections officer, you're going to do 2 years of college-level study, including things like human rights law, psychology. To become a corrections officer in most prisons in the States, you're going to get a few weeks of training. It's going to be mostly self-defense and crowd control. But they see the role as completely different. Their job is to identify the problems that got the individuals into prison in the first place and work on those.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. It's I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Bill Keller. He's the founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization that covers criminal justice here in this country. His latest book is entitled, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. One of my favorite songs, Bill, is from Michael Jackson, and it's the track Human Nature. And it reveals so much about who we all are as individuals so that we can eventually grapple with how to live and how to work better together as a community, knowing full well that there are those who aim to manipulate, right? Who aim to steal, who aim to kill, or have a desire to inflict harm upon someone else. Does the human instinct, Bill, to punish those who do wrong keep us from wanting to seek rehabilitation programs for prisoners?
Yes, in a word. I'll tell you a short anecdote. Once I took the job as editor of the Marshall Project, the first get acquainted meeting we had, that Neil and I had, was with the people who run the Innocence Project. They do amazing work getting people exonerated who've been wrongfully convicted.
Absolutely.
And on the way back, Neil said something that I've never forgotten, which was, we're sort of the guilty project because the Constitution wasn't written just for the pure of heart. You're entitled to be treated with respect by the cops. You're entitled to a fair trial with a competent lawyer. You're entitled to humane treatment in prison, even if you're guilty. And most people who are in prison are guilty of at least of something.
Right.
Most of them have plea bargained their way into it by admitting that they're guilty. So just to get back to the point of your question, there's a 200-year history of tension between our professed faith in second chances and belief in redemption on the one hand and our urge to punish on the other. I think of it as sort of the Quaker tradition and the Puritan tradition, which is probably unfair to both the Quakers and the Puritans. But yes, there is, and it's not just American, there's a human nature and there's a practical reason for punishing people. Otherwise, they won't take the laws seriously, and we are a nation of laws. That said, the punishment is often way out of proportion to the crime, and the means of punishment that we've come up with don't make us safer. The magic 4 words, 4 justifications for locking people up are punishment, incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. We do, in fact, incapacitate people when we lock them up. At least they can only harm other prisoners and staff. But then they're going to get out. Eventually they get out. There's 600,000 people every year get out of state and federal prison. And if they haven't learned anything to alter their behavior while they're behind bars, they're just as likely to commit crimes again.
That's right. And you speak about that and some instances in the book, that process of when someone walks out of the prison walls. There was a quote that said something about, darkness of the world immediately hits them once they are leaving, darkness in and of itself. They're
right.
Walking into a dark world that wants that $50 check that when they walked out with,
That line came from Brian Kelly of PEP.
I love
who
that.
described getting out of Huntsville after his 20 years or so. And, you get out of prison and you get $50 and a bus ticket to Dallas or Houston, where all kinds of people are waiting there to relieve you of your $50.
There you go. But here's the thing, Bill, and again, humans have that same kind of thinking as it relates to shunning them away, right? There's a thin line in trying to forgive someone who walks into a school and opens fire in a classroom full of toddlers, or someone who's convicted of a double homicide and serves hundreds of years in prison. Or to be less dramatic, someone who breaks into your home or your vehicle and steals valuable property from you. There's a part of us, we're like, finish him, kill him, punish him. Why are you intruding on my space here, and I don't want to have anything to do with you, but you must be punished. Is there an educational piece that's missing, when it comes to transforming minds of those outside of the prison walls to reach them in hopes that they can view rehabilitation as something powerful and worth exploring for people behind bars? Sometimes I think that as a public citizen, we just have a very bad vibe with bad guys, or women.
I get that too. I say in the book, my wife's mother was murdered in New York City.
That's right.
I've had close friends who were raped, and your visceral reaction is you want to kill somebody, but you can't base a legal system on anger. I mean, yes, you want to take into account suffering of the victim, but that can't dictate the punishment. Cooler heads have to prevail at some point. And by the way, I do believe there are some people who are just incorrigible, whether because of mental illness, because of an evil attitude. There are bad people, but as a general rule, I don't think you want to define somebody by the worst thing they ever did.
And in some instances, media comes into play, right?
No.
Here you are, Yeah, I know, right?
We're complicit.
How do you think that impacts the public's concern
Fans
for prison
the fires.
reform?
It fans the fires. I think we, and by we I mean the mainstream media, the big newspapers and NPR, which I listen to pretty religiously, have gotten better. They've started paying attention to the shortcomings of the criminal justice system in a way that they hadn't before. But it's still even, local TVs, what's the saying? If it bleeds, it leads. Whatever the most fearsome story you can tell is the one you want to start your broadcast with. And it creates a sense of fear, which politicians then fan by exaggerating the extent of the crime rate and pretending that prison is a solution to it.
Coming up, more with Bill Keller, acclaimed author of the book, What's Prison For? We'll take an interesting look at the other prisoners. Do corrections officers who work there feel institutionalized themselves, along with the prisoners? We'll explore. Plus, why is this system here in America so secretive, so mysterious? I mean, we hardly get to see what's really going on inside the walls of our prisons. Where's the transparency? I'm Eddie Robinson. Stay tuned. Our second segment of ICU continues in just a moment. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, ICU with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners.
It's ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Bill Keller. He's the founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization that covers criminal justice here in this country. His latest book is entitled, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration. Bill was the former executive editor of the New York Times and the winner of the Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for his reporting on the USSR. And he's here in Houston and decided to stop by our ICU studios in 3rd Ward on the UH campus here. So we're so grateful for you to join us. ICU spoke to film director Elegance Bratton recently. He has a feature film debut entitled The Inspection, which was based on his own life. He decides to enlist in the Marines to gain acceptance from his mother, who threw him out of the house when he was 16 years old after he told her he was gay. She was a devout Christian woman who worked as a New Jersey corrections officer before she was killed. He never had a chance to reconcile with his mother, and he was a guest on our show, and he shared some really interesting nuggets about his mom. He wasn't allowed to go into any detail about how his mother was killed due to legal matters, but he made the remark that those who work in the prison system are also institutionalized, not just the prisoners.
Everybody who's in jail is in jail. Everybody is institutionalized by the prison system.
Wow.
The prisons that come to your town and want to do business, trust and believe, they are a corrupting force. My mother came home carrying the prison industrial complex on her. And it informed her sense of shame, and it informed her sense of morality. And people need to, in this society, to take that way more seriously than they do.
You dedicate a chapter of your book to this notion, the other prisoners. I want you to give us some more insight into this painful realization, and I wanted to even mention a couple of quotes that you have in this book, which are very, very compelling. One particular quote was from New Jack, guarding Sing Sing in the year 2000. He says, or she, but the quote reads, "Officer after officer will tell you, there's no way in hell you'd want your kid to be a corrections officer. It was a life sentence in 8-hour shifts." Another quote mentions here from American Prison in the year 2018, "It is getting in my blood. The boundary between pleasure and anger is blurring. To shout makes me feel alive. I take pleasure in saying no to prisoners. Who am I becoming?"
There's fair criticism leveled at corrections officers, and I don't want to gloss over that. They can be a force, a resistance to change. Some of them are brutal, although they don't get hired for being brutal. They tend to become more so when they're in. But So, that phrase, the other prisoners, really holds true. It's on the law enforcement totem pole, being a prison officer is somewhere near the bottom, except in the places that have strong guards unions. They're not well paid, and they're overwhelmed. The staffing ratios are such that all you can do is just keep the lid on, and that's your job. You're minding a warehouse full of vats of containers of explosives, and you're just trying to keep them from exploding. You can see how that would, the statistics show a high ratio of PTSD, high suicide rates, high divorce rates. It's not a job to be scorned, and it's certainly a job that could be improved.
And even the film, The Inspection, wasn't about that per se, with, or kind of it was, with the relationship that he has with his mother, he and his mother. But it destroys families. The corrections officers, they're already in a job there, but it almost destroys their own family. And you could see a lot of that happening in The Inspection in this film, even though it was about him and his adventures and, becoming a Marine.
Right. We don't talk enough about the collateral damage of prisons,
right,
which is obviously on the families of the people who are incarcerated and the communities of the people who are incarcerated, but also on the families and the neighbors of the prison officers.
Thank you for that chapter. It's very powerful. Do you think there should be a requirement for prison guards to be trained in social work? Or should social workers be implemented into the prisons to help with rehabilitation?
Well, there are some places that are trying to do that. One of them, which I read about in the book, is North Dakota, about as red a state as you can get. I think there was 65% for Trump in 2020.
Sure.
But there's a lot of Norwegians there, so maybe that makes the difference. But what they've done is try to direct the problem of prison violence and overworked guards by recruiting a different type of official, of officer.
Yeah.
They're hiring people who've done social work or who've done mental health work or other kinds of therapy. And then they're training them. Training, you referred to Germany earlier. In Germany, if you're trained as an official, you're going to do 2 years of college-level work, including criminal justice issues and psychology and human rights law. In the States, you're lucky if you get 6 weeks of training, and it's mostly self-defense and crowd control. But in North Dakota, they've been trying to stretch out the preparedness and include, for example, a lot of how to defuse a tense situation rather than provoke it into a violent situation. With all of these experiments, they're so young that you don't have a long track record to support statistically the claims that they're successful. But they've made a lot of converts out of corrections officials who've tried these and watched them work.
You're more concerned with the rehabilitation part, right? When you think of mass incarceration, when you think of that term, mass incarceration, like you mentioned, the debate for most people is the mass part, because we constantly talk about the number of prisoners and the population increasing, but we don't get to talk about the incarceration part.
That's largely because the walls are designed to keep people out, not just keep them in.
There you go. Can rehabilitation really happen? Talking to a devil's advocate, who's someone listening and saying, give me a break here. Can rehabilitation happen in a facility that has such, so much daily trauma?
The short answer is yes, but you have to qualify that by saying, people ask if I'm optimistic about the criminal justice system.
There you go.
The criminal justice system is a sort of catchment for everything else in society. So for all the poverty and the inequality, the mental illness, the drug addiction, all the problems that we have in the larger society flow down into a sewer, into the criminal justice system. You can't really reform the system until you take some steps to improve the larger society, the education, the health care, the employment. So I'm not optimistic about the transformation of the criminal justice system on its own. However, people I consider heroes in my book are people who are making an effort to do it in spite of the system, who organize college courses on, and that's one area where the data is actually pretty substantial. Rand Corporation has done a study of education and the effects on recidivism, and the results are dramatic. And there are other things that work too. Behavioral therapy, if you get the person actually generally involved and committed in it, works. Some arts programs have been quite successful. The basic problem is, some people talk about defunding the prisons. It costs money to do reform. You need to have trained staff. Sometimes you have to redo the infrastructure so that instead of being like a cage, it's more like a kind of college dormitory, so people can have a trace of normality in their lives. And you need actually not fewer, but more correctional officers so that they have time to engage on an individual basis with the people they're in charge of and sense when the problem's coming.
You're listening to I See You. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Bill Keller. Bill, do you think that's the real reason is the cost? It's just going to cost a lot of money to get all of these resources and programs.
I think it's the biggest reason. I mean, there's also a resistance. People in the system, just like people outside of the system, have that impulse to, other the incarcerated criminal. They're evil people. They don't deserve you. We talked about corrections officers. Sometimes you'll encounter this resentment. They'll say, you're going to give a college education to this crook, and I can't afford to send my son to college. Of course, that begs the question of why can't you afford to send your son to college? But so yes, there is some visceral, there's not a huge advocacy community for the incarcerated, but cost is I think the biggest difference. Otherwise, some of the experiments that I write about in the book would have proliferated. You can't scale them up unless you're willing to invest.
During COVID, there were several videos inside prisons that made their way to social media showing how prison systems were mishandling, the coronavirus. Since then, some prisoners behind bars gain access to cell phones, and they're able to point out other deplorable living conditions happening inside these prison walls. For instance, back in September of 2022, a video of a prisoner in Mobile, Alabama, Castillo Vaughn, went viral on the internet, raising concerns about the treatment of those incarcerated. Are prisons providing adequate care, in your mind, for men and women behind bars? And in your honest opinion, should people have concerns about this across the nation?
Yes, I mean, you should have humanitarian concerns. You should also have public safety concerns, because let me put it this way. 600,000 people are set loose from federal and state prisons every year. 600,000. Now, you have a choice to make as a society. Do you want those people to be brutalized, alienated, stigmatized, and totally lacking in employable skills? Or do you want them to have the attitudes and the skills so that they can be decent neighbors and citizens when they get out? That just, to me, sums up the whole picture of prisons. It's not, you're not doing them a favor by letting them take college courses or learn a trade. You're making an investment in public safety.
There's a weekly series on the Marshall Project, on the marshallproject.org's website. It's first-person essays from people who live and work in the criminal justice system. It's called Life Inside, where folks can submit material, can submit written pieces for their series, for the series. You make a point by saying that, you're not accepting poetry, no op-eds or fiction that's not related to criminal justice, in addition to not accepting or publishing pieces that claim a person's innocence. And, this particular series does not provide legal help or publicize advocacy campaigns. And there's an actual editing process that these pieces and essays go through. Tell us more about the inspiration behind that series and some learnings and perhaps even feedback from those who view these entries.
That's one of the things about the Marshall Project that I'm proudest of. It started fairly early on when we were a group of fewer than 10 people, editors and reporters. And it was an intern who suggested it, that we start doing Life Inside. And it's not just prisoners. We've done COs, we've done lawyers, defense lawyers, we've done all kinds of people, but most of the majority of the pieces are written by people about prison life. I still remember the first one we did was by a guy named John J. Lennon, who's still in the New York prison system. He was at that time in Attica, and he wrote about a guy who was dying of cancer in prison, a bank robber who had to negotiate all of the other horrors of Attica with a colostomy bag. And it was just a powerful piece of storytelling, fact-checked, which is not that easy in the prison system, but
of course.
But we fact-checked it, and there's been a steady rollout of those pieces once a week. There are other encouraging signs about a little more transparency, and what led me to write this book about the prison system as opposed to policing or the courts or the prosecutors was there's a lot of mystery surrounding prisons. We don't see them because of the walls. We kind of don't want to see them because we might be embarrassed by what's being done in our name. But there's an outfit called the Prison Journalism Project that's now about 1.5 years old that has teachers who go into prisons and teach volunteer courses in the basic skills and values of journalism, and then helps the students get their work published. I'm going to be doing a course for them next year. And prisons are still the least transparent institution, not just in the criminal justice system, but probably in our whole society. But it's really important for people to see what goes on in there. And I think most people who do, I've sometimes say that anybody who votes on prison legislation or is in charge of the corrections budget for a state should be required to spend time in prison, because what you see is a colossal waste of human potential.
Coming up, we wrap up our chat with acclaimed author Bill Keller. We'll explore in depth the programs that aim to help rehabilitate prisoners, including projects that focus on education and college prep initiatives being offered in certain prisons in our region. Plus, we'll dive deeper into what other countries are doing to solve these issues. Why can't the United States implement some of their solutions to fix this thing called mass incarceration? I'm Eddie Robinson. A powerful third segment comes your way right after this. If you're enjoying this program, please be sure to subscribe to our podcast, I See You with Eddie Robinson. You can hear all the past episodes and be notified when new episodes are released. Also, please take a minute to give us a review or comment. We love getting feedback from our listeners. You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Bill Keller. He's the founding editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization that covers criminal justice here in this country, and his latest book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration, is out and available now. Bill was the former executive editor of the New York Times. Earlier in this episode, we made reference to an ICU guest from 2021 named Anthony Graves. He was on death row for 12 years, but ended up serving almost 20 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. I asked Mr. Graves what kind of compensation or reparation he received as a result of this huge mistake. Here's what he had to say.
How would you feel if someone told you your life was only worth $1 million? About taking everything from you? Your kids have grown up. They have kids of their own. You've missed out on everything. And then they say, you know what? That's only worth $1 million. How would you feel? I took that as an insult, a slap in my face that you're going to tell me how much my life is worth after you've taken 18 and a half years of it. I could have got angry at that point because I had every right to be angry and bitter at you telling me how much my life is worth. But then how much is your life worth? Right? But I said, you know what? I'm going to use this here and I'm going to channel this in a different way. I'm not going to let you decide how much my life is worth. I'm going to show you how much my life is worth by the work that I do. I'm going to put the value out there on who Anthony Graves is by the work that I do. And then we can figure out how much I'm worth. But I'll be damned if you're going to tell me I'm only worth this amount of money and I'm just going to be satisfied and happy. Because if I was satisfied and happy, I would not be doing what Mr. Graves do today. I would be laying up on the beach with a cocktail.
That's former death row prisoner, now a free man, Anthony Graves, taken from a provocative interview we conducted with him back in 2021, episode 13 of ICU. And it makes one wonder that if there's not much of an empathetic move from the state of Texas, a substantial reparation directed to an innocent man who served nearly 2 decades in prison, then why should we expect a criminal justice system to provide the care and much-needed rehabilitation for those who are guilty of their crimes? Interestingly enough, our guest, Bill Keller, was part of a press entourage of a man who possessed that voice of empathy, Nelson Mandela. As a New York Times bureau chief in Johannesburg, Keller traveled with him in the early 90s, a period that included the end of apartheid in South Africa and the election of Mandela's African National Congress, the governing political party, in 1994.
Yeah, I spent 3 years in South Africa as the Johannesburg bureau chief. Mandela was already out of prison. When I arrived, they were negotiating a new constitution and set dates for an election, the first election where most South Africans got to vote on anything. And I traveled around for part of his campaign with Mandela. Then after he was elected, I made the request that I thought was probably preposterous to just follow him around for a day being president of South Africa. And what was that like? And he said yes. He said I had to bring another reporter with me who's worked for a South African paper, so it doesn't look like he was just favoring the foreign press. But, we got up in the morning in Pretoria, flew on his private jet, chatting the whole way down to Cape Town. He appeared before Parliament. We weren't allowed to sit in on any security-sensitive stuff. But he did a lot of meeting and greeting, and the thing that people don't necessarily understand, people understand that he's a hero, and I've covered a fair number of people who were prominent, but I don't necessarily regard as heroes. He's the exception. But he was a politician. He's just a gifted politician. South Africa's got troubles still, but it is where it is, in part because Mandela decided he would not do what we did in Iraq and strip the military of all of its authority and replace them with your own people. He gave job security to a lot of white civil servants. He gave promises of security to a lot of white farm owners. The transition could have been a bloodbath. For most of my first year there, that was the question that everybody was asking, will there be a sea of blood when the elections take place? And the reason there wasn't is because he's a politician. He knows how to strike a balance and give both sides a sense that they didn't get strip-mined.
Keller would go on to write a biography of Nelson Mandela in 2008 called Tree Shaker, The Story of Nelson Mandela. You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and it would seem that trees need to be shaken when it comes to doing something about criminal justice reform. Keller's with us in studio to talk about his latest book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration.
There is light, at the end of the tunnel in some places, and you explore a handful of model reentry programs that I'd like for you to expand upon. And as I was reading, I was blown away. It's like, ruby red states are really sort of, making some inroads, i.e. Texas. And the prison entrepreneurship program. Tell us more about the training that's going on there and what's happening.
The PEP program, as it's called for short, goes in and selects prisoners for their program. the main criterion, they say, is that they have to want to change. Not everybody does, and it's hard to transform somebody's life if they're not interested in changing it. So they find people who don't have 20 years left on their sentence, and they teach them basic job skills, how to run a small business, and they're encouraged to design proposals for a business they would start if they had some seed money. And some of them actually get their projects started. Baylor has done a pretty thorough study of the impacts of this program, and the recidivism rate is about 8% compared to 23% statewide. In my mind, a more memorable statistic is that 40% of the people who have been through this program own their own homes. And that's probably larger than the home ownership in the population at large. Almost all of them are employed. Some of them are self-employed with running landscaping businesses, truck driving. And it's an impressive program. The results tell you, to some extent they're cherry-picking the likely successes, but success is so scarce in prison that you got to applaud it, even if you stack the deck a little bit in favor of your outcomes.
You also highlight in the book how after the 1994 crime bill eliminated federal Pell Grants for students behind bars, the number of college programs in American correctional facilities plummeted from nearly 800 to fewer than a dozen. Bill, where do we stand right now as it relates to education and college programs offered in prisons here in America?
Yeah. Since they cut off the Pell Grants, a lot of foundations have stepped in, and some universities have stepped in to build back up. I don't know what the exact number is now, but it's not as bad as it was immediately after the Pell Grants failed. Because the education is one thing where the data is just inarguable. If you emerge with a college education, your chances of ending up back in prison are much, much lower than if you come out with just a GED or no education at all. Now the Pell Grants have been reauthorized. They haven't actually started going out yet, but in one of those catch-all bills during the pandemic, some shrewd senator tacked on an amendment that said Pell Grants can still be provided to incarcerated people except for some crimes. And it's up to the Federal Bureau of Prisons to enact that. They haven't yet done it. What often happens with these reform laws is, the proof is in the doing, and they don't always come up with the budget to pull it off. But there's a fair amount of optimism in the prison educational community that the Pell Grants will be back. And they're, on my list of heroes, the educators behind bars are ranked pretty high.
Are there any other solutions, or reformations you'd like to explore and even look into while you continue your work with the Marshall Project, and perhaps questions still left unanswered once the book ends?
Well, there's two ways to look at reform, I think. One of them is look at programming, and you want programs that teach people skills that are marketable on the outside. You want programs that help them develop self-control. You want programs that get them off of alcohol or drugs, and drug addiction is still, contraband drugs are everywhere in prison. So the more programming is one answer, but another approach is to try to change the culture and the context. We've talked a bit about the relationship between prison officers and the incarcerated people. That's one aspect of it. Those prisons that we talked about in Germany and Norway, and obviously we're not Norway, but they approach prison with a different set of principles. Principle number one is your punishment is you don't get to go home. You're deprived of your freedom for some number of years. All your other rights stay intact. So if you're in Germany in prison, voting day comes around, you're going to vote. You're entitled under law to be kept safe, to get access to education. It's not that you're not punished. I mean, these countries have thousands of people in prisons, but the punishment is the deprivation of freedom. It's not being put in prison so you can be punished by more brutal inmates. So that's the first requirement, is to just think differently about prisons. Second one is to individualize the approach to inmates. See it as your responsibility to identify what was the root cause of their crime, whether it was mental illness or bad attitude or poverty or whatever, and then try to address that problem as best you can. The third is what they call in Norway the normality principle. Try as much as possible to make the experience of being in prison like being in the free world. So you have to take some responsibility for yourself. Some of these experimental programs, they don't come banging on your cell door at 6 o'clock in the morning and order you up for breakfast. You get yourself up, you fix your own breakfast. You go to school or you go to a job. You get paid a decent wage. And in Germany, you're required to put part of that wage away so that you have a nest egg when you get out. You have grounds that have trees on them. You have facilities that are a little more like college dormitories and a little less like cages. Because one thing you lose in prison is your sense of what's normal.
You're listening to ICU. I'm Eddie Robinson, and we're speaking with Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist Bill Keller. What I find fascinating is what you mentioned earlier about the lack of transparency within prisons. And it makes me think of, and almost kind of laugh, because it's a part of why I watch a lot of the shows on Netflix and why my mother loves Wentworth, about the Australian female prison system. And, first question, do you watch any of the prison shows on any of these streaming platforms?
Binged for a while on Orange is the New Black.
There you go.
But the other ones are so sensationalized. I watch them for a little bit and it makes my blood boil.
Yeah. They're extremely sensationalized. It's almost like General Hospital behind bars. But it makes me wonder also this mindset that since the majority of people behind bars are minorities or people of color, then you start to see that it's sort of deep-seated and coded in people's brains that blacks or people of color are inherently bad, or they're seen or looked upon as suspicious or wicked, or even unskilled or unintelligent. And that may bring in thoughts, especially with politicians and lawmakers. Why do we want to invest in this? Why do we want to put money into this? Whereas if you look at those shows, and I'm looking at this show, the world's toughest prisons, and places in Germany and places in Nova Scotia, I mean they're not minorities that are behind quote unquote bars, but the men and women are, on some instances, they're white, and they do offer these programs and these incentives. So I guess what I'm getting at is, how do you tackle these ideologies, these mindsets, and help those folks to try and, and look over these notions of race and stereotypes? Sometimes it's even subconscious, right? You don't know what you don't know until someone acknowledges and says something about it. Do you think race plays a factor in any of this as it relates to criminal justice reform happening tomorrow? Across the board, across America?
There's a chapter in my book under the title, What's Race Got to Do with It? And when I have to sum up that chapter, I say basically everything. It's been, 10 or 12 years, I guess, since Michelle Alexander wrote The New Jim Crow, which traced the origins of the current criminal justice system back to slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. And there's an interesting academic argument to have about whether this was a conspiracy or just bad behavior. But she's basically right. Our entire system still bears the hallmarks of slavery. I mean, there are a lot of statistics in the book. I tried to keep them manageable. One that I think I didn't put in was that 1 in 100 American men over the age of 18 is incarcerated. For Hispanic men, it's 1 in 36. For black men, it's 1 in 15. I mean, those numbers are just mind-boggling, and there's a whole other program to be done just tracing. Get Michelle Alexander in here and ask her how she feels about that 10 or 12 years after her book came out. And the South is worse than other places for obvious reasons. There's the big loophole in the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except for people who've been convicted of serious crimes, which turned the slave plantations into convict labor plantations. The prison systems of this country, you can't look at them for long and not believe that institutionalized racism is one of the most important governing factors in how we live.
Of all that you've accomplished, the awards, the accolades, your work with the New York Times, being affiliated now with the Marshall Project, including the important work that you're doing to help us grapple with understanding the purpose of prisons in general, Bill Keller, what life lessons have you learned about yourself thus far?
Oh dear. You're putting me on the shrink's couch. Well, I've learned sort of obvious things like I'm kind of lazy and I'm stubborn. One thing I like about myself is I'm curious. I always tell people that I'm a journalist. That's the opposite of an expert. An expert is somebody who has answers. A journalist is somebody who has questions. And I haven't run out of questions yet. I'm 73 years old, a little shaky, have trouble with, my train of thought. But I haven't stopped being curious.
He's Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author Bill Keller. He's the former executive editor of the New York Times, and his latest book, What's Prison For? Punishment and Rehabilitation in the Age of Mass Incarceration, is now available from Columbia Global Reports, who's the publisher. Bill, thank you so much for being a guest on ICU.
Thank you.
Our team includes technical director Todd Holzlander, producer Laura Walker, editors Mark DeClaudio and John Mitchell Good. ICU is a production of Houston Public Media. Follow us on Instagram and Twitter, and subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen and download your favorite shows. I'm your host and executive producer, Eddie Robinson. And I feel you. We hear you. I see you. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time.